equals 210 degrees. Find the exact value of each expression below. Before we do that, sine and cosine tangent all have some special properties. If you negate the argument of sine, which is a nerdy way of saying if you put a negative sign on theta, on the variable of sine, then it's the same thing as taking a -1 and multiplying it to the outside of sine. Okay, so if there's a negative sign on the inside, a negative sign, that means sine is odd. Okay, same thing with tangent, in case it comes up. Tangent is odd, so negative tangent theta equal, tangent negative theta is the same thing as negative tangent theta. Does the same thing as sine. Cosine is even. So if you have negative 32 cosine, that's the same thing as positive 32 cosine. Oh, I said 32, but I'm keeping it in general. And then they're brother sister functions. You know, the reciprocal trig functions are the same. Secant negative theta, because that's the reciprocal function of cosine, is the same thing as secant theta. And then same thing with cosecant negative theta and cotangent negative theta. Okay. So now we know that. Let's check out the first question. Sine of negative theta. That means that's sine of negative 210 degrees. That's going to be negative sine. Oh, they don't let us do that though. Oh, yeah, let's just write it off over here. Sine of negative theta is the same thing as negative sine theta, right? So that's the same thing as negative sine, and plug theta right in there, 210 degrees. So if your calculator, check it to make sure it's not in radians, okay? Like mine is not, because that's what radians looks like. So 200, just if I type in 210, and if I type sine, now it's negative of whatever sine was, so that's 0. Actually, I think the calculator could just do this. 210, negative, and then sine, yeah, it gives us 0.5. We didn't need to do all that jumbo. Okay, sine squared, this is just notation. Sine squared theta, that's the same thing as sine theta being squared, okay? So we just found out that for this question, sine of 210 degrees, you're just going to square whatever that is. So 210 degrees, sine is negative 0.5, but if you square that, it's positive 0.25. And 2 sine of theta just means find out what sine of theta is, find out what sine 210 is, and then multiply by 2. So that's negative 1. So yeah, I thought they were going to ask you for expressions, but they just want you to actually exact values. Oh, okay, so they want them as fractions. So 0.5 is 1/2. 0.25 is 1/4. Yeah, let's do this one. This one's in radians. Okay. Clear this. So if theta equals 4 pi over 3, so if you got cosine squared theta, remember that's the same thing as cosine theta, which is 4 pi over 3, they said, being squared. Okay, and so cosine 4 pi over 3, you could do that if you've memorized the special reference angles, reference triangles. Okay, 4 pi over 3, if you draw that on the unit circle, there's pi. 4 pi over 3 is right around here. So this is pi over 3 for an angle down here. And what's opposite of pi over 3? You could convert pi over 3 to degrees. Okay, pi over 3 is radians, so if you multiply it by 360 degrees, divide by 2 pi to make the pi's cancel out, to make the radian units cancel out, it's going to give you 360 over 6, which is 60 degrees, okay? So in the brick and mortar classroom, I have my students memorize just 2 special triangles. What's opposite of 60 is the side length square root of 3 over 2. In these triangles, what's opposite of 30 is 1/2. Because the triangles that we draw in the unit circle, they always have a hypotenuse of 1, okay? So if this is square root of 3, that means it's 60 degrees, and what's opposite of 60 degrees is square root of 3 over 2, and what's adjacent is 1/2. So cosine is the adjacent divided by hypotenuse. So cosine 4 pi over 3, that's a negative 1/2, sorry, and that's a negative square root of 3 over 2, because we went to the left on the x-axis, almost forgot that. Then we went down on the y-axis, okay? So cosine 4 pi over 3 is negative 1/2 divided by 1, because it's adjacent divided by hypotenuse. And then if we square that, that's positive 1/4. You could have done it the same way with a calculator if you know how to convert from decimals to fractions, okay? And now cosine pi over 2, theta over 2, that means you're taking 4 pi over 3 and dividing it by 2, right? Take theta, which is 4 pi over 3, and divide it by 2. So that's times 1/2, in other words. So that's 2 pi over 3. So they want you to evaluate this. Cosine 2 pi over 3. No, that's not right. 2 pi over 3. Oh, I forgot to divide by 2, didn't I? Divide by 2, divide by 3. That's 120 degrees. Okay, so 120 degrees lands you here. And so if that's 120 degrees, this is 60 degrees down here, right? Because to make the full semicircle, to make 180 degrees, you've got 60 degrees left. And we just saw what's opposite of 60 is square root of 3 over 2. The adjacent's 1/2. That's a negative 1/2 because, look, you're going negative on the x-axis. And that's a positive square root of 3 over 2 because it went positive on the y-axis. And a hypotenuse of 1. So in other words, the cosine of this triangle is just true. It's the adjacent, negative 1/2, divided by the hypotenuse. So negative 1/2. And I'll back these up with a calculator in just a second. Now in cosine pi, we just found out that cosine 4 pi over 3 is negative 1/2. So 2 times negative 1/2 is just negative 1, right? And if you wanted to check this with a calculator, make sure it's in radians if you're just going to plug it straight in, okay? You get to see what my reminders are. Okay, so cosine squared theta means find out what cosine of 4 pi over 3 is. So 4 times pi, divide by 3, and then cosine of that in radians, make sure your calculus is negative 0.5. But this says square your result, right? So I'm going to square what cosine 4 pi over 3 was. 0.25, which is 1/4. So we just backed up our answer. Now do it again. Theta is 4 times pi divided by 3. But then it says divide whatever that is by 2. Okay, divide theta by 2. And if you find cosine of that radian measurement, it's negative 0.5, which is what we have here as a fraction. And then cosine theta, here one more time, 4 times pi divided by 3. Cosine of that radian measurement times 2 gives us negative 1. So all of them checked out with our calculator. Two different ways doing the same problem.